Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast brought to you by MyBookie and Twisted Tea. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And man, do we got a loaded show for you guys today. Two guests on the show. John Neighbors back to respond to some of these Mizzou fans that have been living in his mentions since last week. Had him on to talk Sam Pittman and the future of the Arkansas Razorbacks. And, of course, it's a Tuesday, so that means it's a Stephen Lassan Tuesday on the show. Deep dive. We were able to hit on all the teams with Stephen, some of these coaching hires, SEC championship preview, and a whole lot more. So, busy show, like I was saying. And right before we recorded here, breaking news from ESPN. We're going to get into a lot more of this with Cousin Shane tomorrow, but some of the 2024 schedules have leaked. And I'm not going to go over all of them right now, but highlighted by Texas at Texas A&M, November 30th. So Thanksgiving weekend, not Thanksgiving Day, but Thanksgiving weekend. Texas and Texas A&M will finally be meeting once again on the gridiron. Could not be more excited for that. But hey, a lot to go over. A couple firings here at Florida. I mean, This was a busy day at the SEC. So let's kick it over first. If you're watching on the video, you just have to click right here. I'm not going to include it. But audio listeners, let's kick it over to this interview with John Neighbors. All right, appreciate John being a good sport and hopping on the show. But like I said, it's a Stephen Lassan Tuesday. Went well over an hour with Stephen. So let's kick it over to that interview. Once again, can't thank Stephen enough for joining the show. All right, post-Thanksgiving, but we still got our weekly guest here, Stephen Lassan, senior editor at Athlon and Sports. Stephen, how was the greatest weekend of college football over at the Lassan household?
It was glorious. There was entirely too much food consumed, turkey, ham, all the fixings, plenty of dessert, and most importantly, plenty of football. And, of course, the craziness that is the coaching carousel, the transfer portal. Maybe it is the greatest time of the year because it was pretty crazy this weekend. And, of course, we can't complain with all the leftovers as we're eating we're eating those and watching Missouri play Arkansas and all the games on Saturday, too.
Right. And obviously I wanted to ask you to share your thoughts on the new SEC head coaches that we have. Mike Elko at Texas A&M, of course, Jeff Lebby at Mississippi State. But something that just popped into my mind here. I mean, we just had Thanksgiving, and we had these openings for, you would probably know better than I how many days, but I mean, we're talking like a 2-week window. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago and beyond, I mean, that sometimes it would take months to land a coach, and you know, everything is sped up. So, I mean, there's good and there's bad with it, but certainly some of the quickest coaching searches that I can remember in the SEC. How about you?
You're 100% right about that. I think that is an interesting kind of storyline that we're seeing play out because the season ends and then the next sort of cycle starts, which is roster management in terms of transfers and in terms of recruiting, building a staff. The portal opens on December 4th, the day after all the bowl games are announced. So the window to maintain your roster before players can go into the portal and others can start trying to land those players is pretty small. So the cycle is definitely speeding up. You don't have time for an extended search. You've got to get a guy in who can maintain what you have, but also start to focus on adding players, some other teams, and start to fill the roster because like it's not only the portal, it's also the first signing date too. So the signing date and the transfer portal, those two dates have sped up everything. You've got to get a guy in as quick as possible to maintain your roster.
Right. So let's get into the new Texas A&M coach first. Mike Elko, of course, a familiar name. He's been at A&M before as a outstanding defensive coordinator, Notre Dame as well, and obviously most recently at Duke, turning around the Blue Devils. Thoughts on this hire? And I got to ask, too, would you prefer Mike Elko or would you prefer Mark Stoops for Texas A&M?
What was your favorite moment of the Mark Stoops Texas A&M era? I don't know about you, but it was the hour I probably spent like snooping for information on Twitter or a message board. But no, seriously, I think I would rather have Mike Elko. I think you know what you have in Mark Stoops. I think there's probably some upside in hiring Mike Elko. The search itself was messy. There's no doubt about it. Like the whole process was messy, but the end result is the right one. They got their guy. And it gets at kind of what you and I talked about, I guess, just a week ago, which was A&M didn't need a splashy hire. They didn't need to go out and get the Dabo Swinney, the Lane Kiffin. They didn't need a big name. They just needed somebody who was going to be kind of hard worker, blue collar type coach and willing to work to figure out why A&M has all these resources and all this potential and it hasn't translated into wins. And I think Mike Elko's the perfect fit to do so. The track record of being a strong defensive coordinator when he was at A&M, great defenses. No surprise, maybe, that after he left, the program was sort of trending in the wrong direction. He goes to Duke, 2 winning seasons. I wouldn't read too much into their record this year because they lost their starting quarterback kind of midway through the year, and they still managed to finish 7-5 after being one of the most improved teams in the country the year before. So it's only 2 years, but you have to like the improvement that they made at Duke and his track record from being before at Texas A&M. I hate sometimes the word fit, but I think this is a strong one for Texas A&M. If I had to grade it, I would give it an A right now.
Mm-hmm. And right before we hopped on the line, Stephen, just want to get your reaction on this as well. Chris Lowe, ESPN senior reporter, he's released a couple of the games for next season already. And the one I really want to ask you about, November 30th, Texas at Texas A&M. We're bringing it back. A&M, LSU will not meet to close the regular season. It's going to be the battle down there in the great state of Texas. Thoughts on Texas and Texas A&M meeting in the finale? Sarkisian, Elko. I mean, this could be one heck of a battle.
Oh man, our Thanksgiving is about to get like 20 times better next year with this game coming back. I mean, I remember when these two teams were in the Big 12 and even before that, Thanksgiving weekend was just perfect to see Texas and Texas A&M playing. It was always one of my must-see games growing up, the rivalries between these two. So I'm excited just personally that it's back. It's one of college football's best rivalries, but for it to be at the end of the year, and you think about the potential stakes, the next year we're going to have the 12-team playoff, but putting all that aside, Mike, like you said, Mike Elko versus Steve Sarkisian. What if it's Arch Manning? What if it's Quinn Ewers against Texas A&M's defense? Lost in all this, and I probably should have said this when we talked about Elko, I think Texas A&M can turn things around pretty quick next year because you had if Connor Wigman and that supporting cast comes back on offense with what Mike Elko is going to do on defense next year, they're going to be picked high in my personal ranking. So you're going to have a matchup of two teams that's going to be ranked high at the end of the year. They haven't played in some time. Count me in. It's going to make rivalries in the SEC even better to have it at the end of the season.
Yeah, and back to Elko's hire. I mean, I don't think in any shape or form A&M should have made the hire simply because of continuity is not even the right word because he has been gone, but he's familiar with it. He's familiar with some of the players. I have to imagine, recruiting them to College Station, some of the staff members that are already there. But that being said, that's not why you hire the guy, but it is an added bonus. Given it in today's modern age with the transfer portal and NIL and all this, how much do you think it'll help that he's got those connections to where maybe some big time players that are eyeing the transfer portal, maybe they'll stick around because they're more than familiar with Mike Elko and who he is and the defense he runs and everything that goes with that. So that, in my opinion, is really going to help the Aggies. What do you think?
100% agree with you. I think it's going to help a ton. I think if you're on the roster or you're a recruit, a transfer, whoever you are, there's no unknown like with Mike Elko. You know who he is. He's been there before. If you're bringing in someone like Mark Stoops, you're going to wonder like what's he going to be like? What's the internal like culture? How is this all going to work? I don't think there's any questions about that with Mike Elko, and I think you've seen a lot of players who were at Texas A&M under Mike Elko when he was the defensive coordinator come out very strong in terms of supporting him. Kind of everybody that I've seen seems to be really behind this hire from former players, and I think that can only help. It seems like everyone's on the same page, and I don't know that that would have been the case if there was any other hire here. Also, I think keeping Elijah Robinson on staff is huge too. He was instrumental during this stretch as the interim coach, extremely popular. If he can keep him on board and continue to, with the big time salary pool that they have, only add to that. I think, like you said, you don't bring a coach in for continuity, but in this case, it's more about what Mike Elko can do to raise the bar there based upon what he did at Duke, and also what he did as defensive coordinator there.
Yeah, and if there's any information on this, I apologize, I've missed it. There's a lot going on, but as far as offensive coordinator, I believe he had a pretty good one at Duke. You would know better than I. Bobby Petrino, obviously, already in place at College Station. If you're Mike Elko, where would you go? Would you keep Bobby Petrino? Would you try to bring the guy from Duke, or would you? It's been revealed they have an $11 million salary pool, so I would imagine he can, with that figure. I mean, you can attract any candidate in the country. Where would you go if you're Mike Elko for an offensive coordinator?
I think if you can make it work, isn't keeping Petrino pretty intriguing? I think the last couple games, especially on Saturday, and then of course the game before, without Fisher's interference in the play calling, there's a lot to like about what Jalen Henderson was doing. And I know it'll be different next year with Connor Wigman. I think Bobby Petrino, despite all of his faults as a head coach and everything else, I think he's still a pretty dang good play caller. And so I think if you can make it work, it makes sense. Kevin Johns is his offensive coordinator at Duke. They were last in the ACC in scoring in the year before they arrived there. And I think they were 8th this year in scoring and 5th the year before. And again, the offensive numbers at Duke this year are skewed a little bit because of their quarterback injuries, but they were significantly better on that side of the ball. But I think if you're talking, who would you rather have? I think you'd rather have Bobby Petrino if you can make it work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly don't want to just completely overlook Jeff Lebby to Mississippi State. So can you share your thoughts on that, Stephen? And, I've heard some snickering from Ole Miss fans. Hey, they're getting Lane Kiffin light here. They're trying to be just like us. Well, as I understand it, Stephen, and I was totally unaware of this, but apparently Lane Kiffin and Jeff Lebby are not on good terms. And a lot of that had to do with Kiffin firing Randy Clement's former offensive line coach. Now he's the offensive line coach at North Carolina. I would be surprised if he's not your next offensive line coach at Mississippi State. But if you recall, they fired him, I believe, in the middle of spring practice about a year or two ago. And not long after that, Jeff Lebby left there as well. So I don't know if it's bad blood, but, this ain't just two buddies here. This is I think that adds a little layer to it, to me, to that Egg Bowl rivalry.
I'm glad you said that, because I think based upon Lane Kiffin's Twitter kind of polls and retweets and just his log recently, I kind of just assumed that it was just a little friendly banter between the two of them, because they were because of course, like you mentioned, Lebby was on his staff before. So I guess it's adding a little spice. I mean, as if the Egg Bowl really needed any more spice, right? We got a little bit more. But I think, first of all, if you think about college football, like the modern era of college football, like let's just say it's like 2000 and on, any kind of coach that's won at Mississippi State has pretty much been an offensive-minded head coach. You think about Dan Mullen, you think about Mike Leach. So I think Jeff Lebby is sort of in that mold of offensive-minded coach that could be hard to prepare for, doing something a little different. It's totally different than what Zach Arnett and that staff was doing. So I think if you're looking for the positives, I think he gets the SEC. He's coached there before. The offensive angle, I like it. And I think you also have to just like the idea of being a team that's difficult to prepare for, that can also probably go get players right away from the portal at quarterback and receiver who want to play in a high-powered offense. His offenses at Oklahoma were incredibly productive. There was some frustration this year from a lot of Oklahoma fans about some certain specific calls against Oklahoma State, but over 40 points a game, over 500 yards a game this year at Oklahoma. So the production was there. The only thing he really lacks in this case is just head coaching experience. But Dan Mullen was the first time head coach at Mississippi State. So that's the kind of the theme with all of head coaching hires. You just never know. It's a crapshoot. I think it's pretty solid for Mississippi State. Would I have preferred a Jamie Chadwell, a Willie Fritz, or John Summerall? Probably. But I also get it why Mississippi State's hiring Jeff Lebby.
Right. Yeah, and I think they certainly tried to get Chadwell, but I don't think they, as I understand it, could get him to come there. But yeah, I think about 25% of the SEC's running this offensive scheme now, and it's been so successful. So certainly not knocking it, but I say all the time, Stephen, and I'll hold to it. And hell, I'm wrong all the time. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But I would never hire a head coach that's never done it, not in the SEC, because we gave the last guy 10 games. You know what I mean? There is no room for learning on the job, particularly at Mississippi State, where it's a very difficult job. And if they come out next season and win 4 games, not saying that's going to happen, but if they do, he's on the hot seat immediately. And he may be one of the best coaches in college football in 10 years, but they'll never know because he'll be gone before then. So I don't know. I think you got to take that all in consideration. And is it fair, Stephen, to say this is, kind of swinging for the fences and kind of like it's going to be a home run or it's going to be a strikeout? And for me, it's kind of hard to see an in between right now. And again, there may be, but we have no knowledge of him building a staff. We have no knowledge of him building a recruiting board. I hear he's very popular with his players. So I'm not questioning any of that, but it's a little bit different when you gotta meet with these boosters. You gotta do NIL meetings. You gotta do this. You gotta do that. You have to be everywhere. We have no knowledge that he can handle any of this. So do you think it's fair to say this is boom or bust type hire?
I actually think that's a perfect way to describe it. Like I was trying to think after Lebby was hired, like it really does seem like this is going to work out really, really well, or it's going to be like a bunch of 4 and 8 seasons that it ends quickly for him. And I think to your point, it's almost like you look at the Mike Elko hire, he got a little bit of seasoning at Duke, and now he's coming back into the SEC. You think about, okay, what coaches are on the hot seat next year in the SEC? And you can point to maybe Billy Napier, Sam Pittman, Clark Lee. I mean, it's a little bit of a stretch, but like Shane Beamer, maybe. Like, what's a common denominator for most of them? 3 out of the 4 didn't have head coaching experience at the FBS level before they were hired there. So I always prefer guys who have head coaching experience. But I also think in this new era of college football where you almost have to be as good at the organizational stuff, that I think we have to be a little bit more open-minded to maybe more of like the CEO type coaches where they're just hiring good assistants. They're really good at roster management. That's a little bit different in this case because I think Lebby is going to be very much hands-on with the offense. So I guess all that to be said, I would always prefer guys who have head coaching experience. But I think to your point, if you can't get Chadwell and you don't think you could get Fritz because he's not going to interview until after the AAC championship game, and maybe the same thing with Summerall, you want to move quick. Lebby's got experience in the conference, and you think there might be some potential here to be like a huge home run type hire. You're going to score a ton of points, I'm sure. So it's really going to be popular in that regard. So yeah, I think it's good. Very much could be a very boom or bust hire, but if you have to move quick, he's available because he's a coordinator and he's not a head coach waiting for a conference championship game.
Right. Well, how ironic, Stephen. I wanted to ask you about some of these coaches that coming off a rough season. And let's start with Billy Napier. I kind of go back and forth with old Billy. Even though they've been losing, I've been kind of impressed with the offense, particularly. Again, they keep losing, but they're close games. Teams fighting hard, pushed Mizzou to the limit. LSU, Florida State. Heck, they had complete control of Florida State for a while. But Stephen, here's my issue. Here we got players spitting. We got quarterback sliding. He's not going to get even close to the first down marker. We got two guys blasting him. We're running double reverse passes when we got all the momentum in the world, and we're damn near in field goal range, and could have went up 20 plus points on Florida State, but we just kind of blew it. And I don't think there's any world Billy Napier gets fired unless there's some scandal this calendar year. So he's coming back. But Stephen, if we got more of spitting and the stupid stuff, having two guys on the field with the same jersey and looking completely unprepared, we can't blame it on youth anymore. Next season, I don't even know if there's going to be any Mullen holdovers. I feel like Billy Napier, short of maybe Sam Pittman, is on the hottest seat in the SEC. Is that fair?
That's 100% fair. I think by year 3, if you don't have a winning season at Florida or tangible progress, then I think you're very much on the hot seat, or you're coaching your way out of the SEC. I think on something you said there, it feels like a lot of small things this year have added up in big ways for Florida. It's the discipline in the Florida State game. The silly trick pass killed the entire momentum. The penalties against Florida State, the spitting, the hitting the quarterback, that helped Florida State win the game. I mean, it's a very winnable game. Florida had Florida State on the ropes at one point, and Florida State sort of stabilized itself. But it's the small things like that. It's the discipline. It's strange play calling. It's the special teams. It's kind of a strange sideline lack of organization for a team that's got a lot of people on staff at times. So those kind of things by year 2, I'm not sure you should be seeing if you're a coach like Billy Napier with the experience that he had at Louisiana and Florida. So I think if you're Napier and you're looking for a reason for optimism and you're trying to sell your fans on something, I think you have to sell the bulk of the 2 deep is coming back next year. The preseason expectations had Florida at somewhere 5 or 6 victories. They finished 5-7. They were a handful of plays away from beating Missouri and Florida State, maybe. So you can sell a lot of players are coming back. You're adding a good recruiting class, and also you may have your quarterback in Graham Mertz. And if he doesn't work out, you've got a 5-star coming in a quarterback. So you have some things to sell. And if you're Billy Napier, you can sell quarterback development. Mertz was considered maybe the worst quarterback in the SEC, and he's been a lot better this year. But I think what would worry me is when I look at the defense and I see where they are statistically, how they played this year, that side of the ball is still a big question. I'm not sure that is just an off season away from getting better. And just how do you clean up all of the small errors that we talked about? Like those 2 things seem to be the biggest hurdles for me for Billy Napier this offseason.
Yeah, and to his credit, I mean, he's making changes already. Corey Raymond, very popular around coaching circles. He's fired. I think it was Sean Spence, defensive line coach. He's out too. So, again, these are popular guys, but defense was a huge issue. So, hopefully for the Gators, this kind of corrects some of those issues. Maybe they just didn't, the cohesion was not there with Austin Armstrong. I'm not sure. But
also, I think fair to wonder, too, will Billy Napier hire an offensive coordinator or maintain play calling duties? Because it does seem like sometimes there has been some strange play calling. I like the development of Graham Mertz and some of the usage of some things, but there has been some strange play calling at times, and maybe he just has too much on his plate, which maybe you hire an offensive coordinator and that fixes some of that. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of hot seat, Stephen, it's got to be Sam Pittman, probably on the hottest of hot seats, maybe even in the country. I got fans, anytime we do one of these shows, Stephen, they're like, when are we doing the emergency Pittman's been fired show? You know what I mean? Like it's awful. Now I root for the guy, but this is now 2 seasons in a row. We're falling short of expectations. Doesn't sound like KJ Jefferson will be back, and he was one of the few things we had to cling to. Just had a big linebacker enter the portal. We have to get an offensive coordinator in here, and it's got to be an elite one. So, thoughts on Sam Pittman and the likelihood that that he's even the coach in 2025. What's your thoughts on that?
I think first of all, when you're talking about like the fans and when is the Sam Pittman kind of firing episode going to be? That's also part of the problem in this is because if you think about after that announcement was made, and even before that, the fact that they got blown out by 30 plus points to Auburn and lost to Missouri by 30 plus points, it's a good thing that they made that announcement when they did, because after the Missouri game, that noise probably only would have gotten significantly larger. So in some ways, the vote of confidence probably came at the right time for Sam Pittman, which brings me to next season, which is every time Arkansas loses a game, you know exactly what's going to happen. Is it's going to be the hot seat? Is this it for Sam Pittman? So he's in a very, I think, precarious position here. I think that it's very perilous to think that his tenure is going to be able to go on past the 20, into 2025, 2026. Of the coaches that we'll talk about here, I think I'm probably the least confident in right now. I think number one, you've got to hire an offensive coordinator. You give Sam Pittman a lot of credit for transfers plus coordinator on the defensive side of the ball. That side of the ball is better than it was last year. But can you bring in enough from the quarterback, offensive line, receiver, coordinator to sort of microwave a very productive offense in a very short amount of time? It's possible, but I also think kind of the trend line here and just the overall momentum for Arkansas is not good. Credit to Arkansas, I think, this season too, for fighting in that very very difficult stretch there where they played LSU, A&M, Ole Miss, and Alabama, one of the most difficult stretches of the season. They fought hard. At the end of the year, it fell apart, and now they have even more questions, and it's hard with a coach on the hot seat, I think, to go out and be able to hire a very good offensive coordinator because they may only have the job for 10 games or so.
Right. And, if Hunter Yurachek, he'll never admit this, but if he's being honest, you think he regrets making that proclamation before the Missouri game, or do you think these guys are maybe not as knee-jerk as a lot of us? And I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I think he's probably not as knee-jerk as we are, and he's probably not as knee-jerk as the fans probably wanted to be. I think, and I don't know whether this plays into this or not, I think, does it help Sam Pittman that he is well-liked there? Compared to some of the other coaches, looking at you, Jimbo, that were maybe a little bit more on the abrasive side of things, I think Sam Pittman being a very popular, likable person could have helped him. Also, if Mississippi State couldn't hire Jamie Chadwell, what does that tell us something about the coaching market? I don't know if it does or not, but I'm sure that a lot of these ADs and agents are talking, and if there's a lot of inclination that, hey, maybe this guy doesn't want to move this year, instead of paying a buyout and getting into the unknown, what you have next year, and maybe you can just go out and pay big for an offensive coordinator. If you have to guarantee his contract for 2 years, you do it, but it's better than spending $30 million to buy out one staff and hire another, and you just have even more questions because you don't want to end up with another Chad Morris, basically.
Right. What's your thoughts on Shane Beamer entering next season? Because, again, we just missed a bowl for the first time, which is not good, obviously, but exceeded expectations first 2 years. I think that's fair to say. I had someone put it to me like this, Stephen. Shane Beamer is who they thought he was, and then he upset Tennessee, he upset Clemson, and they thought, okay, we got something. And then he's back to who they thought he was this year. So, I mean, that's kind of a sad way to say it. And I'm not sitting here saying we should fire Shane Beamer, because I think he's shown promise, but he doesn't have the greatest reputation outside of Columbia. Take that for what it's worth. And I mean, I even got head coaches in this league reaching out to me with their issues with Shane Beamer. And again, they shouldn't care about that at all at South Carolina, not if the guy's winning. But, he's made some questionable coordinator hires. And where will this team be without Spencer Rattler? That's a huge, huge looming question. So where do you put Shane Beamer? Do you think he enters the season on the hot seat? And, like let's say if they miss a bowl game again, I don't know, could he survive that, do you think?
I think he can. I don't think he's on the hot seat. I think I would characterize him as it's maybe starting to get a little warm, but not warm in the sense of like if he has a bad year, he's on the hot seat. I think we're looking more at like 2025 or so. I think you have to give Shane Beamer a little bit of, I don't know, credit for navigating so many injuries. I mean, South Carolina's offensive line was beat up this year. They lost Juice Wells for a significant portion of the season. I probably came into the year thinking that 6-6 or 7-5 was probably the ceiling for this team based upon the schedule. So the fact that they came to 5-7 on the doorstep, if they just win that Florida game, I think maybe we're having a completely different conversation here. They were close. And so I think if you give him another offseason, as long as the recruiting momentum continues, you get healthier on the offensive line, you sort of restock your skill positions, quarterback room, if you need to go out and get a transfer to compete with Sellers. I think you could easily see this team back in a bowl game next year. The schedule was very difficult this year. It's going to be challenging again next year with the new teams coming into the league. But I don't think hot seat yet, but I think next year would be pretty crucial to get back to at least to a bowl game.
Yeah, and I say this with the utmost respect, Stephen, but those fans are crazy down there at South Carolina, and I love them for it. They just got high expectations. They want to win. They want to win big, and that can help you. That can hurt you. I mean, because they'll turn on you on a damn dime here. But the only other guy I think I was going to ask you about, Stephen Clark Lee, and I hate it. I was railing about this on our last show, just how basically anytime an SEC team plays Vanderbilt, it's a bye week. We had this great week of rivalry games, and it's like Tennessee's irrelevant because they're playing Vanderbilt, and it kind of is what it is. But if Vanderbilt were to go 0-8 in SEC play again next season, would they bring Clark Lee back? And my opinion is they would, because I don't think they really care about football. But what's your thoughts?
I think they would. Personally, I probably wouldn't if I was calling the shots there at Vanderbilt. I know that he inherited a mess and there was a lot of work to be done there. But by year 4, if the 5-7 season in 2022 is the outlier and you've got 3 0-8 seasons in SEC play, I think that's pretty telling. I think the other alarming thing about Vanderbilt is Clark Lee's a defensive guy. Why is Vanderbilt ranked last in the SEC in points allowed for 2 consecutive years? Even if this team was 0-8 in SEC play, I still thought that when he was hired, at least the defense would be somewhat competitive. It would be maybe not a shutdown group, but they would cause problems, and they could lean on that while they figured out the offense. And it just has not been very good under Clark Lee's watch. So I think that's a little alarming. The backdrop of all this is Vanderbilt's doing some things with their stadium and some of the facilities like we've seen this year. He talked about a multi-year plan when he was hired, but at some point you have to show progress. And I think 2024 would be a good time to start doing so, because 0-8 in the SEC, apathy sets in at some point when you have, potentially a 2-30 record in SEC play if they go 0-8 next year.
Yeah. Any other coaches that you'll have your eye on? And not that this guy's on any kind of hot seat and not that they should fire him, but Mark Stoops, winningest coach in Kentucky history. But I heard it. I'm going to steal this because I didn't come up with it. But it was like he got caught at the restaurant with his girlfriend this weekend, with all this A&M stuff. I think that's a perfect analogy. But him or anyone else that, again, that is entering a huge, huge season next year.
That's a great analogy, by the way. I think first, yeah, I think, I want to see, first of all, I'm curious about the backdrop with Texas and Oklahoma coming into the league. What does it do for a lot, just to see how it shapes out with some of these other programs? Because, I want to see like Missouri, can they continue to build off of this next season? You also have, like a program like Auburn. Like, I'm curious, does Hugh Freeze get kind of Auburn closer to being back on track? I think Brian Kelly at LSU, I don't think, I should mention these coaches aren't anywhere close to the hot seat. I think it's just more of me being intrigued about where their place is in the SEC and what it might mean. So I think just sort of figuring out what the new entrants mean. Can some of these coaches build on what we saw this year? Does someone like Brian Kelly get LSU closer to conference title contention after maybe a little bit of a disappointing year? There's really not many coaches on the hot seat outside of the ones we talked about. I think it's just kind of maybe a year to judge trajectory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get you. Well, two teams that they're not having any of these concerns, Stephen, and that's, of course, Alabama, Georgia in the SEC championship game. Yeah, the regular season anyway, I guess, is over for most, but biggest game of the SEC year to date is still to come in Atlanta this Saturday. Cannot wait for this matchup, and this will be a first one in a while, Stephen. I guess since it was Georgia and Alabama, but a lot of times we get these SEC championship games that are not very competitive, and it's almost like, man, they should have. If only they could have sent two of the West teams or two of the East. I mean, even last year. Of course, Hendon Hooker was hurt, but let's live in a world where he didn't get hurt. Tennessee versus Georgia in the SEC, that would have been a hell of a lot better than what the game we got. But this time we're getting the two best in the SEC. Of course, maybe Missouri, they would have an argument otherwise, but two of the at least three best in this monumental showdown. And do you think it's going to be a ball game? Do you think, or could one of these teams run away with it? What's your early read on this game?
I think we'll have a ball game. It's the third time since 2018 that these two teams have played in the SEC championship game. And you think about how epic some of these games have been recently between these two teams, always playing with high stakes, I think is the interesting angle. And there's a ton to stake. Obviously, this Saturday, it's not just the SEC championship. There's implications for something bigger beyond that. And it could mean that one team gets in the playoff for the SEC. It could mean two. It could mean none. So I think the backdrop to all this is Georgia is now in the pole position. You have Alabama sort of in hunt mode because the angles have reversed. Georgia used to be kind of looking up at Alabama. I think this year it's Alabama looking up at Georgia and trying to do what they did in 2021, which is pull off the upset. Go into Atlanta with one loss and beat Georgia and get to the college football playoff. So high stakes, a lot of stake within the SEC and nationally, but also the way that this sort of series has shifted in the last couple of years is also pretty intriguing. And also sort of at your question, I do think we'll have a pretty competitive game on Saturday.
Who do you think has a better quarterback in this matchup? Jalen Milroe or Carson Beck? Who do you think is playing better football right now?
It's a great question. Carson Beck didn't have his best game against Georgia Tech on Saturday. I don't read too much into that game. If I'm Georgia, I think it was more survive. Let's get back to Atlanta next week to play Alabama in the SEC championship game. Jalen Milroe is brilliant against Auburn on the ground and through the air. I think based upon last week, I think Jalen Milroe is playing a little bit better. But I think over the course of the season, I like the way Carson Beck has played. When we come to all SEC voting at the end of the year, I will probably vote Carson Beck just ahead of Jalen Milroe. But it's close. I think they're both playing at a top 10 level nationally. And also, I think within the season, both of these guys came into this year as unknowns. And I think the development of those two was sort of going to guide the trajectory. And Carson Beck, that second half against Auburn and how much he gained confidence and grew up, and it's carried throughout the year. But Georgia just can now rely on him to go out and execute in those type of situations. And for Alabama, you think about the loss to Texas, wasn't sure what was going to happen after that offensively, especially in that ugly win against South Florida. Jalen Milroe became a superstar in the second half of the season. So I think it's interesting that both programs at quarterback went into the year with some uncertainty and came out with two superstars that are going to be top 10 quarterbacks this year and certainly next year in 2024.
Which team do you think has the better defense? Because they both shown some flaws. Again, last week maybe a little bit of an outlier, but they both were run on quite effectively. You know, the lone highlight for the Tennessee, but I mean, right out the game, they scored a touchdown. They didn't do anything the rest of the damn game. But I don't know, because this certainly seems to me, Stephen, to be and again, worst is probably the wrong word, but it's probably, if you were to rank this year's defense with the last two for Georgia, I don't think it's, without a shadow of a doubt, this is the worst of those. But again, we're talking about two national champions here. So who do you think's got the better defense in this showdown?
I would probably lean Georgia, but not by much, to your point. One area that would worry me if I'm Georgia, the rush defense. They're giving up almost a full yard more against the run than they did last season. And you think about what Auburn did, and you think about Georgia Tech, and some of those runs sort of stretching in Missouri too. Like you get to the edge of the perimeter, the edge of the defense. Teams have had success there. So if I'm Alabama, whatever combination of Jace McClellan, if he's healthy, Jalen Milroe, the combination maybe of those two, like there probably is going to be some plays to be made on the ground. I also think we've seen this year. Georgia gives up a touchdown early. They figure things out, and the rest of the game is an absolute nightmare for the opposing offense. So Alabama is certainly better at getting to the quarterback with Dallas Turner and Braswell. I think Georgia's secondary, if it's healthy and everyone's there, and of course Jamon Dumas-Johnson, I don't guess he's probably going to be there. Getting those guys back would help. Again, it's a toss-up. I would probably lean Georgia. Do you have a strong lean in this one?
Honestly, I think I would probably go Alabama. I think they're a little bit better on defense. But again, it's by the thinnest of margins here. I'm talking here because Georgia certainly, they are capable of shutting you down. I'm having nightmares of that Tennessee game after the opening play. But how about this question, Stephen? What is a weakness that each team has that you think the other team can exploit, if that makes sense? Is there anything that stands out to you that Alabama can exploit on Georgia and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think we kind of touched on it a little bit with the defensive chatter there. I think, to your point, I think like you're talking about thinnest of margins. These two teams are like top 10 defenses. So if you're talking like one's better than the other, one is like fifth and the other is like eighth or third or fifth nationally, there's not much difference. I think if I'm Georgia, I think what would worry me is some of the, like I said, the iffy play sometimes against the run. Like if Milroe and the running backs get going, it's not that they may have success, but it's also they could kind of control the tempo of this game. Because I think if you're Alabama, a little bit lower scoring game probably plays to your benefit. So I think if you're Georgia, you would love to get Alabama sort of out of that and force them to be throwing more, not allowing Milroe to sort of dictate the game with his legs. Alabama proved it could win a shootout earlier this year when they played LSU. I just think they'd probably rather have a little bit more balance offensively. So I think if you're Georgia, you worry about Milroe and the running game, sort of seeing what some of these teams have done and being able to exploit that. And I think on the Georgia side of things, maybe one angle would be Alabama secondary in games against teams that had high profile quarterbacks like Texas, like LSU. I think if you protect your guy at quarterback, I think there are plays to be made against the secondary. Again, you're kind of looking for like the slightest of margins here because these teams are so good. But Texas threw for 349 yards. Jaden Daniels had some success before getting hurt. So I think Carson Beck is protected with the weapons. I think Georgia can move the ball through the air. And if you're Georgia, I think you'd like to test Alabama's offensive line. Maybe you're not getting the sacks, you're not getting the tackles for loss, but we have seen that this offensive line at times, even though it's gotten better, is not the elite Alabama offensive line that we've seen in Atlanta in some of these SEC championship games.
Right. And, man, Georgia's just got so many weapons. They're just, if you try to focus on one thing, there's 3 or 4 other guys that can kill you. And I think, Stephen, let me ask you this. Which coordinator are fans going to be more upset with come Saturday night? Mike Bobo or Tommy Rees?
Oh man, can't you imagine this game coming down to like a goal line stand and Georgia not running the ball and we have to hear the run the ball Bobo things for all summer long? I'm gonna guess it's gonna be Tommy Rees because I well maybe we can talk about a prediction here in a few minutes, but I might be tipping my pick here. I think Bobo and Kirby Smart are going to have a solid game plan. If fans are upset with one coordinator, it's going to be Tommy Rees after this game.
Yeah, all right, yeah. So that's what I was going to ask you. If you got an early prediction, and provided things can change throughout the week, maybe if some key players are out or anything. But do you have an early prediction for this ball game?
I do. So a couple keys that I'm going to be watching. I think if you're Alabama, you've got to be able to pressure Carson Beck. I think you got to be able to get the run game going. And I think you got to get a couple big plays from Milroe in the passing game. Like we saw Saturday, the big play from Milroe to Jermaine Burton. You're going to need a couple of those. So kind of a standard formula if you're Alabama. So those are kind of a couple things that I'm watching. And I think if you're Georgia, don't give up the big plays in the passing game and sort of control Milroe in the pocket in the Alabama running game. Few things I'm watching. All that being said, I'll throw this out there. I think Alabama might be the team that gives Georgia the hardest game the rest of the year. I'm not sure that Michigan, I'm not sure that Florida State, Oregon, or Washington can match up as close as Alabama does. So I think this might be Georgia's toughest test the rest of the year. Mm-hmm. All that being said, I'm getting to my prediction. I like Georgia in a close one in the SEC championship game. I think another thriller.
So you may have just answered this, but provided there's no like devastating injuries, God forbid. But I mean, this is really like the national championship game, don't you think?
I think so. Injuries I think certainly could shape this playoff a little differently. And it already did, because I do think if Florida State had Jordan Travis, I think that offense could give Georgia's defense a lot of trouble. I don't think they would have won, but I think they would have been a good matchup for this Georgia team. Watching Michigan, I don't know there's going to be enough in the passing game to threaten Georgia if they meet in the national championship. Certainly Washington's defense would be no match for Georgia's offense. Oregon is interesting because I do think that they play a little bit of defense, and certainly Dan Lanning and, of course, Bo Nix. So Oregon, I think, would be interesting, but I still think that by far, if you told me all of these teams the rest of the way, I think Alabama will be the toughest matchup for Georgia, barring something changing that the rest of the year.
And you hinted at this, breaking this game down, but do you think there's some kind of any psychological edge for Alabama being the hunter instead of the hunted, and just, for a year or plus, having to hear about how good Georgia is and how they're the real dynasty now. And I've not seen it from Georgia, but you have to wonder at some point, like if you watch that god-awful Florida Netflix documentary, they basically said football is not fun. And, by the end of it, it was just you win or you're just a failure. And even slight wins were not celebrated by those Gators because that's not what they were being judged by, and that's not how this Georgia is being judged. They'll only be judged. It's a win. If you win it all, it's a complete failure. If you lose by 1 point in the national championship game, which it's probably not the way it should be, but that's the reality of it. So, any psychological edge for Alabama in this matchup?
Potentially. I think because I guess I would look at it like this. If I'm the underdog, if you're Alabama, like you're not the favorite. I think Alabama sort of expects to win though. Just because I think, though the success they've had, and I think Nick Saban, I think the standard, like they expect to go into Atlanta and win this game. But I think if you're Nick Saban, you're printing up all the Vegas spreads and you're probably going to, post like pictures of my like game breakdown on the internet all over the facility that shows Georgia winning and all that. I guess to your point, if I was in this position, Alabama being the hunter instead of the hunted is probably where I would like to be. It's a little different, like I said, because Georgia's kind of been in this role, and now Alabama's going into the SEC championship game loose, sort of nothing to lose. I mean, Nick Saban's laughing at the end of the Iron Bowl because hey, I think I would rather be the hunter in this scenario instead of having the favorite status and the pressure on me if I'm Georgia.
Right.
But I don't think Georgia, I guess I should say, I don't think either team's intimidated by each other either. Like I think that's what makes it interesting too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know certainly, Stephen, the last couple of weeks, fans have really appreciated your bowl predictions or bowl projections, for the SEC. But before we get to those real quick, is there a scenario to where there is a no SEC teams in the playoff? And I have to imagine, I mean, it's kind of obvious. If Georgia wins, there's no shot they're getting left out. But is there a scenario to where Alabama wins and all the teams get left out? And is there a scenario where Alabama wins on Saturday and both Georgia and Alabama make the playoff? What's your thoughts on that?
Yes. To answer your questions, yes, all of them are possibilities. So first of all, I would say I would be surprised if the SEC gets left out, because I think if Alabama wins, yes, Texas would have the head-to-head edge, but Alabama would have just beaten the committee's number one team. They would also have a win over LSU team that they'll have in the top 15. They'll have a win over Ole Miss. That's a pretty solid resume. It's hard to leave Alabama out. Also, Florida State still has to get past Louisville. So there's a lot still at stake this weekend. So I would be really surprised if the SEC gets left out. If you wanted to make a scenario that it would be just that. It would be Alabama wins, but the committee keeps both Alabama and Georgia out, Texas getting that last spot, provided Florida State wins as well. And in that scenario, you would get like Michigan, Texas, the Pac-12 champion, and Florida State. So if you're an SEC fan and you want to see two teams in, I think you need to root for Florida State to lose, and then maybe even root for Texas to lose to Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. And there's a path to get two SEC teams in the college football playoff.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, so let's get into your latest SEC bowl projections, which obviously we only got Alabama and Georgia remaining. So I have to think, there's little that can affect these moving forward, but you still got Georgia in the playoff.
Absolutely. So Georgia is my number one projected team for the college football playoff, and I've got them playing in the Sugar Bowl against old SEC friends Dan Lanning and Bo Nix and the Oregon Ducks in the first round of the playoff.
Oh, Bo, he can't avoid them dogs. You know what?
It might be Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Bo Nix, although I think Jaden Daniels should win it, but that's a different story.
Yeah. All right. How about some New Year's Six matchups? You got several potential SEC teams heading to the New Year's Six.
Absolutely. So let's start with the Cotton Bowl. Alabama versus Washington. I'm picking Oregon to beat Washington in the Pac-12 championship game. So I've got the loser of that game playing Alabama in the Cotton Bowl. Also, I've got Missouri versus Penn State in the Peach Bowl. Worth noting, Missouri should be in great shape to make the New Year's Six. It could be the Peach Bowl, it could be the Cotton Bowl. Probably not as likely to be in the Fiesta Bowl, but they are in very good shape, barring some sort of chaotic rankings shenanigans by the committee this week.
Yeah, come on. We got to throw Mizzou a bone here for this out. Heck, I mean, I would make the argument they may be the second best team in the SEC. So to not have them in the New Year's Six would be disgraceful, I think.
Agree with you. Yeah, they've not only have they earned it at this point of the year, based upon where they are in the committee's rankings. If they moved Missouri out of that slot, they're just doing it out of like some spite or some weirdness to put some other team in there, because there's no other like reason to move them down. They should be in the New Year's Six based upon the wins and also from where the committee has liked in the last couple of weeks.
Right. And so interesting here, Stephen. I get these are our SEC cousins here. You got Texas, Tulane, and the Fiesta Bowl. Does that mean? Are you projecting that the Longhorns lose, or do you think they win the Big 12 but still get left out of the playoff?
I think they win the Big 12 and they fall just short of the college football playoff. So I've got them in the Fiesta Bowl to take on Tulane. This also gets at the problem of slotting in Missouri, because I think even though I don't believe Missouri and Texas are going to play next year, if I remember the schedules correctly. So I think they'll try to avoid even SEC matchups, even though they don't play next year. So I think that's kind of the problem of seeding Missouri, is because you have Alabama, you have Texas. If that's not a problem, you could see Missouri playing maybe Texas in the Fiesta Bowl in sort of a old Big 12 game and a new SEC game going forward. But yeah, Texas, Tulane in the Fiesta Bowl.
Well, and this is why Texas had to come in the SEC, because you can win a Big 12 and get left out, but never shall you win the SEC and get left out of the college football playoff. That's a guarantee.
Hey, they could use a little help in the maybe strength of schedule department to try and catch one of those teams in the playoff. They got a good win over Kansas State, but kind of a shame that Oklahoma wasn't in there. I would love to have seen an Oklahoma-Texas rematch in the Big 12 championship game.
I was rooting for it, man. Yeah. BYU let me down last weekend.
Yeah, I know what you mean, man. I was rooting for Dylan Gabriel versus Quinn Ewers Part 2. Fell just short.
All right, and you still got LSU Notre Dame in the ReliaQuest Bowl. That's just too good of a matchup not to get, huh?
Oh, yeah, spicy. Talk about Brian Kelly playing his former team. We'll see if Jaden Daniels plays in the bowl game, but could be a good quarterback matchup, Jaden Daniels versus Sam Hartman of Notre Dame. But I think the storyline of LSU versus Notre Dame is just too good to pass up.
Yeah, and we just could not get a more diverse matchup here. Iowa, Ole Miss. I mean, that's going to shake Lane Kiffin to his core to watch Iowa film, I think.
Yeah, Iowa's got a great defense, and they might make Jackson Dart and Quinshon Judkins' life difficult. But offensively, there are some challenges. So you would have a great offense versus an outstanding defense over there in Iowa. But Ole Miss getting to the Citrus Bowl, I think, could be a big deal. Another 10-win season, falling just short of the New Year's Six, barring some breaks going their way, I think.
Mm-hmm. And how about the Music City Bowl, Stephen? That's emerging as a really great bowl annually. And as soon as they get the new stadium, sounds like they may be in the mix for the college football playoff rotation in the near future.
For sure. Yeah, I think you'll see the Music City Bowl try to move up the pecking order of the postseason, and especially with the stadium. I think it'll certainly help with that. But in this matchup, I've got Texas A&M versus Wisconsin. I think you want to talk about just a great matchup of two outstanding fan bases. Wisconsin fans love to travel. You've got Texas A&M, all the off-season momentum they're going to accumulate won't necessarily mean anything in a bowl game, but I think the Aggies and Badgers would be one of the more entertaining games outside the New Year's Six if this ends up being the bowl matchup.
Right, and those Badgers, man, I can't imagine the damage they do on Broadway down there. So
right.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah, all the bar owners will be very happy.
How about our other SEC cousins, Stephen? You got in the Alamo Bowl, the Oklahoma Sooners playing Arizona, red hot Arizona that somehow lost to Mississippi State.
Yeah, if I think Arizona would probably like to have that Mississippi State game back because if they played them now, I'm not sure that one would be close based upon how Arizona improved. But yeah, Alamo Bowl, Arizona, Oklahoma. You want to talk about offense? I think if this matchup works out, get ready for some offensive fireworks. These two offenses were red hot at the end of the year.
Yeah, just like them Vols, who you got facing Mac Brown in the Gator Bowl. I mean, that'd be a pretty exciting matchup.
Absolutely. I mean, I think wasn't the Music City Bowl like I don't know how many years ago, and it was the crazy extra. Was that the extra man in the field with
Derek Dooley, baby?
Right.
I mean, we got robbed in that one. Let me just tell you.
Right. I didn't want to bring up any bad memories, but if Tennessee wanted to get some revenge, they might be able to do it in the Gator Bowl. North Carolina having another kind of second half slide to the season, but Drake May plays. He's one of the top quarterbacks for sure in next year's draft. Would be a good matchup for Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. And then the Duke Mayo Bowl, we're gonna get some. Someone's gonna get the Mayo bath. Could be old Stoops.
Yeah, maybe that's why he wanted the A&M job.
Oh, against Duke. Oh my God. Yeah, basketball game, right? They might as well play a basketball game. They get a bigger crowd down there.
Is this the Texas A&M coaching cert? The Duke's Mayo Bowl presented by Texas A&M boosters here. Mark Stoops versus Mike Elko's old team in Duke. Yeah.
And then last but not least, you got the Texas Bowl. You got Auburn and Oklahoma State. I don't know if a single Auburn fan would go to this game after the way that Iron Bowl ended. They're probably done with football for the year.
Yeah, I tell you what a weird like end of the season. Like they could not be more polar opposites from the loss to New Mexico State and a near win against Alabama. If you wanted to, you could see the SEC and the bowl partners maybe flipping Auburn and Texas A&M here, getting Texas A&M to stay in the state of Texas, meet up against an old Big 12 foe. I think Auburn, Oklahoma State would be intriguing. But you're right. I think momentum would probably be on the side of Oklahoma State coming off of its Big 12 title game appearance.
Yeah. Oh, well, all right, Stephen. The last thing, I really appreciate your time. I asked you to come prepared for some grading of these SEC teams here. And, kind of what I'm thinking is just, however you want to grade it. And I get it, the season's not technically over for a lot of these teams, but for some of them it is. So it didn't seem to make sense to me to wait a couple weeks because some of these I would imagine you already got a grade for. So let's just go in alphabetical order based on how the season is today. Alabama, what letter grade would you give the Crimson Tide for their season to date?
I have to give you a caveat that I've always been regarded as a very light grader. So many times people have told me they wanted me as a professor in college for this reason. So take that for what it's worth. For Alabama, I gave him an A. So some early turmoil, I think fair to say, the loss to Texas, the bad performance against South Florida, I should say. But they
felt
rebounded.
Like a loss.
It felt like a loss, right? Yeah, it definitely did. So they overcame all that early trouble and still found their way to get to 11-1. They found their quarterback and they're playing for the SEC championship game. So I gave them an A. If you asked me in October, I think my grade would have been different, though.
Yeah, well, we're about to find out how easy of a grader you are, Stephen. What would you give them Arkansas Razorbacks?
I gave him a D. Almost for disappointment, because coming into the season, I thought they could be a 7, maybe 8 win team. They had the best quarterback in the SEC in the preseason rankings in KJ Jefferson. The loss to BYU early on kind of set the tone. You give them credit for fighting, I think, in the middle of the season when the schedule was tough, but too many bad showings late in the season, disappointing losses to Mississippi State and BYU, and of course the coaching whiff by Sam Pittman to hire Dan Enos and fire him during the season.
Yeah. All right, how about Auburn, Stephen? And I asked our audience to give out grades too, and one person got very creative. They gave him an E for escorts. I don't think you would give Auburn that, but What grade would you give the Tigers?
Oh, I don't know if I can top that one. I'll go with C plus. So I think you give them some credit for pushing both Georgia and Alabama, the two best teams in the league. You got to give them a negative grade for whatever was going on with the passing game this year. It was abysmal. And the quarterbacks, the receivers often did not seem on the same page, whatever it was. And the loss to New Mexico State, I think they deserve that, has to impact their grade. So bowl eligible, improved, but too many questions. And I like the performances against the best teams in the league, and that's why I gave them a C plus.
Yeah, it would have been the most Hugh Freeze thing ever to lose to New Mexico State and beat Bama, but it nearly happened.
I think to some extent they probably started looking to Alabama 2 weeks ago before they played New Mexico State, and
Oh yeah.
a good New Mexico State team showed them what would happen if you overlooked them, basically. Or maybe it's just Jerry Kill. Hugh Freeze.
All right, how about Florida? What grade would you give them?
I gave him a C minus. I really wrestled with this one because I gave Billy Napier a bump for getting Graham Mertz on track this year. Preseason expectations were 5 or 6 wins. They hit that range. The win over Tennessee was good. Performances against LSU and Missouri, near misses. But like we talked about at the start, just so many small things went wrong. So it's a C minus. I could maybe be convinced to go D plus. Do you think I'm too kind with that?
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, I get it. But we were sitting here at 5-2, and there was a lot of promise, and it's just kind of hard to get over that finish to be 5-7 after being 5-2. So this is a borderline F for me. Plus, they ruined Tennessee's season, so that may be part of it.
Yeah, I think Billy Napier's texting me to see if I could be his athletic director next season.
Probably the easiest one on the board. What grade would you give Georgia?
A plus. If undefeated again, in position to win their 3rd straight national championship. They may not be as good as they were last year, but they're still a team to beat. No blemish on the record. A plus.
Mm-hmm. All right, how about Kentucky?
C. I think the win over Louisville probably salvaged this one for Mark Stoops because the great start to the season against an easy schedule, a win over Mississippi State to get bowl eligible, and then a collapse, but a win over Louisville kind of saves them. So I gave him a C. I don't love the defensive regression. The Devin Leary experiment didn't work out as well as I thought, but to get to 7-5 after beating your rivals should count for something. So C for Kentucky.
Yeah, I almost wonder if maybe A&M fans just missed that Louisville game because their game was on at the same time, and had they known Mark Stoops won that game, maybe they would have been more warmed up to old Stoops. You know what?
Yeah, hey, that's true. I guess maybe if you're Texas A&M, you would have just if you wanted Mark Stoops as your coach, you just wanted LSU to blow out A&M, and you could watch the full game.
All right, how about what grade would you give LSU?
I gave him a B. I wrestled with this one too because I do think they were a little disappointing, especially on defense. To be that kind of where they were in the defensive statistics this year is certainly surprising to me. I do think this staff deserves a ton of credit for getting Jaden Daniels to be one of the top quarterbacks in the country, because if you watched him as a quarterback at Arizona State, I don't think you would have guessed that he would be a Heisman contender just based upon how he played there. So I'm giving them credit for the Jaden Daniels development. I'm also going to give them some credit because their losses were to Ole Miss, Florida State, and Alabama, 3 top 15 teams, but slightly disappointing because they won the West last year and didn't get back this year.
Right, and you kind of had a sense that was coming when they lost to Ole Miss, who another 10-win season, lost to the 2 teams that are playing for the SEC championship. So I have to imagine your grade for Ole Miss is pretty high.
Absolutely, it's an A. I think 10 wins again for Lane Kiffin. The only losses, like you mentioned, to Georgia and Alabama. You would like to see them close the gap maybe a little bit, and especially since Alabama was vulnerable this year, for that game to be a little bit more competitive. But still, it's hard to argue with 10 wins being on the doorstep of the New Year's Six if you're Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss this year. And I like the development, too, of Jackson Dart. A nice job by the staff this year to get him to be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC.
Yeah, and then on the other end of the spectrum, unfortunately, Mississippi State, what grade did you give them?
I gave them a D minus. The win over Arkansas and Arizona might have salvaged this from being an F. Just too many blowout losses, regression on offense and defense. I'm, like I said, outside of Arkansas and Arizona, I'm struggling to find reasons to bump this grade up any.
Mm-hmm. And then Missouri, that's got to be a really high grade for the Tigers.
A plus. There's, I mean, certainly. Sure. Would you have liked to have beaten Georgia? Yeah. I mean, they pushed Georgia in Athens. They won 10 games. Cody Schrader should be an All-American. Eli Drinkowitz pushed all the right buttons as far as hiring staff, recruiting. They're going to be in a New Year's Six Bowl. To me, that's deserving of an A plus. What a great season by Missouri.
Mm-hmm. And then how about South Carolina, where, man, as soon as those comments were made about the hot dogs, it was kind of downhill from there, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, it was. I gave them a C minus. And I weighed preseason expectations into this because I thought they would finish somewhere in that 5 to 7 range. If you told me they finished 5 and 7 and I didn't see any of their games, I might have felt a little differently, because I do think some of the way that the defense played this year and the offense kind of leads me to some bigger questions going forward. But if they won that game against Florida, I think we're having a different conversation here. But instead, they finished 5 and 7. The schedule was tough. They navigated a lot of injuries, so I went with C minus. Do you think I'm too nice to South Carolina in that one?
Yeah. I mean, you make a lot of good points. I really thought, there was an off season of hype that I never bought into. I would certainly add, though, that I think Spencer Rattler, as strange as it is to say, he exceeded my expectations. But basically, the entire team outside of Xavier Legette failed to live up to expectations. So, yeah, I think that's a fair grade. I really do.
I think those 2 games at the end of the regular season may have skewed sort of the expectation level for South Carolina, if that makes sense. Like beating Clemson and beating Tennessee, just 2 offensive outliers compared to the rest of the year, probably gave us a little bit of a wrong impression to some that maybe they would be a lot better this year. I mean, even I at one point I had them in my preseason top 25. And then I think as we went into the off season, I think you kind of realize that the roster concerns might have been a little bit greater than you thought based upon those wins, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, one team that, it's been a roller coaster of emotions over here, Stephen, Tennessee. You've talked me off the ledge a couple times. What would you give the Vols after going 8-4?
I gave them a B minus. Feel free to tell me I am too kind, but I think losing Hendon Hooker, losing Jalen Hyatt, if this is the low point for Tennessee's offense, this is still, I mean, things are looking up long term for Tennessee. So in what was a rebuilding year to some extent, I think maybe you'd like to have one more win, but some of the losses also weren't that big of a surprise to me, and the defense got better too. So I gave him, like I said, B minus. Am I too kind?
Yeah, I think so. Because again, it's just so hard to get over that Florida loss. I think I was inexcusable. I think the fashion in which they were losing to Georgia and Missouri was inexcusable. And I mean, now could have totally turned it around had they beaten Alabama, which you may mock that sentence, but they were in complete control of that game. They had every path to victory there in Tuscaloosa, but yeah, they just kept. I mean, I can't look at the schedule and see a good team that they beat. A&M, Kentucky, their best wins. That doesn't impress me.
You're probably right. Maybe I should have been a little harsher. Maybe like a C, maybe.
Yeah, that's probably where I'd put it.
I mean, I think there is something to be said, like the losses, like you mentioned, like they weren't really competitive outside the first play against Georgia, and Missouri going from where they were last season to New Year's Six, completely passing Tennessee, and then a pretty much a no-show by Tennessee in Gainesville. Those things are concerning, but I also think if you step back and you still see like, hey, this is an 8-win team a year after they lost one of the better quarterbacks in the country, and they've got a superstar potentially ready to step in next year. Maybe things aren't so bad. That's probably why I went with B minus.
Yeah. Well, agree to disagree. All right. How about A&M? Where you got them graded after they fired Jimbo? Which
D.
I give an A for firing Jimbo.
Right. Yeah. Probably F for on field and A for firing Jimbo Fisher. I went with D. 7-5, which is obviously better than last year, but every kind of swing toss-up game that they had, they pretty much lost it. You think about Miami, think about LSU, Ole Miss, Alabama, Tennessee. All those games were, I think, sort of winnable with all the talent that A&M has, and they lost all of them. So better, but not good enough. And like you said, A for getting rid of the coach, but D for on-field performance.
Yeah, well, I would imagine, speaking of poor on-field performance, Vanderbilt, that's going to be an easy one, right?
F. I tried to look at a reason to give them like a D minus. 10 straight losses, bottom of the SEC, basically in offense and defense, 0-8 in conference play. It's hard to find reasons to be optimistic here, I think. If I'm being unfair, please feel free to call me out, Mike.
Nope, that's enough time on Vanderbilt as it is. How about our SEC cousins? So real quick, Oklahoma. I was very impressed with the strides they made. It seemed to me they kind of ran out of steam there at the end, which I guess is understandable in the middle of a rebuild, if you want to call it that. But that big Texas win, that was very impressive. If I'm an Oklahoma fan, I'm pretty fired up about the future.
Absolutely. So last year they were 6-7. And I think I was on your show this offseason, and I said, keep an eye because they lost so many close games that they'd be a lot better this year. Here they are, 10 victories and just on the outside of the New Year's Six and finishing in the top 10. So I gave them an A minus. 4 wins better than last season. They beat Texas. They did run out of steam, like you said, at the end of the season. But also I think program trajectory coming into the SEC, I think they're on rock solid foundation. Recruiting's going well. Line of scrimmage is getting better. Everything that they need to be competitive in the SEC is there. And they play a little bit of defense, although they're not quite there yet. Their defense is better now than it would be if Lincoln Riley was still the head coach. So that's a positive too.
Yeah. And then how about Texas, which, hey, they don't get mentioned that often when it comes to these teams still chasing a national championship, but they're still, on the outskirts of achieving that. Only one loss. It was a big loss, no doubt, but they so much hype always with Texas, and they always fail to live up to it. But winning at Alabama, they lived up to it this year, no doubt.
I gave Texas an A for this season. The only reason it's not an A plus is they seem to have this weird thing where they get ahead in games, and in the second half they sort of stumble. And we saw this against Kansas State. We saw this against Houston and TCU. Doesn't really matter now because they're at the end of the season and they're playing for the chance to make the college football playoff. So all the memes, is Texas back, all that stuff. They're a win away and some help from making the college football playoff, and they beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa this year. So I think that's deserving of an A, and maybe I'm even being too harsh on them. It might even need to be an A plus.
Mm-hmm. And all this coach talk, Stephen, I know I'm throwing you a curveball here right as we're closing out, but their future in the SEC, Sarkisian at Texas, Venables at Oklahoma. Which one do you think is poised to last longer, so to speak, as the competition ramps up and it's just a completely different animal than it is playing in the Big 12 as playing in the SEC? Which coach do you think will have a longer run at their current school?
Was jokingly going to ask you how soon is the Alabama job going to come open, so Steve Sarkisian can get in the mix there.
Hey, that's a fair question to ask too.
I think I think Sarkisian is probably the right answer here. I like the job that Venables is doing. That's no knock on Brent because, like I said, the program is in a very good spot coming into the SEC. Their defense has improved. It's still got some steps to go, but I think just the foundation that Sarkisian has, and if Quinn Ewers goes to the NFL, they've got Arch Manning. Brent Venables has Jackson Arnold. They're both loaded with 5-star quarterbacks for the future. But a little teaser here. I think if you start looking ahead to next year, I think Texas is going to be in the top 8, 6, maybe of preseason polls with Alabama and Georgia. So Oklahoma won't be far behind, but I think Texas is going to be ahead next year coming into the SEC.
Yeah. Already thinking of 2024 with that talk and the schedule of talk. I mean, it's right around the corner. You know,
we haven't even finished the championship games or the bowl games. Let's start throwing out our early top 25s, right?
Right. Well, hey, we went a little bit long. I really do appreciate it, Stephen. Before you go, as always, can you tell the audience where can they find your work and where can they give you a follow?
Absolutely. So you can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven. I'm also Stephen L. CFB on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, all CFB 365 is my YouTube channel. Would love for you to come over, subscribe, check out what I've got there. And I co-host the Cover 2 podcast at Athlon Sports. It comes out on Wednesdays. We preview everything in college football. So Wednesdays, Cover 2 podcast. Would love for everyone to check that out as well.
All right. So, hey, Stephen, thanks again. Can't wait for next week. What a epic weekend of games we got here. Not only, not obviously the SEC championship, but so many others, the ACC, the Big 10, the Big 12, they all have, Pac-12, all have playoff implications, and they could determine how many, if at all, how many teams from the SEC go to the college football playoff. Cousin Shane be back on the next episode. That's going to do it for this one. Appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you on the next one.